Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the program on constitutional government, and I'm Harvey Mansfield, and our guest today is Roland Fryer. He's a professor of economics at Harvard. He's a MacArthur genius. Look at him, and you can see he has MacArthur genius written all over him.
You're the only one who's ever said that.
And he's won the John Bates Clark Medal from the American Economics Association. He's going to talk to us about the truth about policing in America. Note that he's an economist and not a political scientist. He's part of the insidious creeping imperialism of economics toward a takeover of political science. Aristotle, you probably don't hear that name very often. No.
There are a lot of words in here I haven't heard in a while.
All right. Said that political science is the master science. Because why would that be? Because political science decides whether and how to use the other sciences. Look at the movie Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer himself didn't decide whether to drop the atomic bomb. That was Harry Truman, using his knowledge of political science to do so. So economics has become more and more absorbed in what used to be called non-economic questions. It used to be that the difference between economics and political science was that an economist would occasionally say, that's a non-economic question, and set it aside. But a political scientist never says, that's a non-political question. So Gary Becker is one of the most notable of those who have taken economics into what used to be political questions. I had an experience with him one time. I had the honor of being invited to the University of Chicago to his famous seminar that he gave for Harry Becker and Richard Posner. And I talked to him about honor and whether there was any economic explanation for that. And it took me, they said, they let me speak for about 15 minutes before interrupting.
That's a long time.
That is a long time, that's what they said. Yeah. But I never convinced them that that this was a possibility. And in political science, we have a creeping imperialism of my colleagues who are called the quants, the quantitative political science, which wants to imitate economics. So Jason Furman and the late Alberto Alessino started off in political science, but they both saw that the grass was greener in the economics department and made their way over there. But Roland Fryer is a friend and a student of the great Glenn Loury, another economist who's taken up political issues. He's going to speak today to us about the truth about policing in America. So, Roland.
Thank you. I think I'd like to change the title after hearing that introduction to the truth about social science, but we'll do that next time. It's so great to be here on so many dimensions. I think it was 15 years ago I was in this room, and at that time talking about it was a very political science type question. I was trying to understand how to measure gerrymandering. And I got into a big debate with Gary King, which I really enjoyed. I'm not sure he enjoyed it as much as I did, but I'm really happy to be here because I've wanted to debate Harvey for a very long time. So it's great to be here. And I'm not sure I would lead with Aristotle. I think all those guys were drug addicts. I'm not sure that's the right model. In any event, I do want to talk about police. I want to talk for just a bit, and then I'd love us to do an old school thing we used to do here. I've been at Harvard for 21 years now, and years ago, we would kind of put up a topic as incendiary as this. I did this on purpose, and then we'd actually debate and disagree, and it was wonderful. Those were the good old days, and we used to do it until the early morning hours. We're probably not going to do that today, but I'm happy to be here and happy to debate this topic, which I think is, really one of the most important socially in America. I think a lot depends on a lot of decision making in inner cities, depends on and is influenced by how local authorities, in particular the police, treat them. We did a study on mobility. We did the most simple thing you could imagine. We went out and we found 2,000 people across America in different cities, all of which were born into poverty. And let's say 30% of them got out of poverty by the time they were in their 40s. We spent 4 hours with each one of them in their homes, asking them questions, old school stuff. And when we looked at kind of the top 10 variables that predicted escape velocity, what it took to get out of poverty, one of those variables in the top 10 was really about the interactions they had with police officers. So I think this area of police use of force, what to do when it's unconstitutional, is something I'm fascinated by, in part because it also puts my own biases at play with social science. I don't like the police very much, I have to admit. And when I first took on this issue, it was after the Walter Scott video. The first couple of videos, I just thought, law of small numbers, this kind of sucks, but I'm an economist. We're not very emotional. We don't care about things like honor. Although it's very easy to model that, I'll tell you after the seminar. And I remember going up to my colleague, Andre Schleifer, and saying, this is really easy. I think I want to help. And he says, you're going to go protest? And I says, what are you talking about? No way. I'm not leaving my air-conditioned office. But I will, maybe we could introduce some data here that would help people. And so I had this really bizarre and bonkers idea, which I won't share with you because it was terrible. And we went to dinner that night. We met in the hallway in Lit Tower. We started talking about it. And he said, what are you doing for dinner? I said, nothing. So the conversation spilled over into dinner. And at dinner, he asked me, what do you think the police are maximizing? And I was really embarrassed that I had never thought about that. And it's so natural for an economist to think about, how agents are interacting in a larger game, what the equilibrium are of that game, et cetera. And I had not thought about the police side of the story whatsoever. And although I didn't tell him at the time, I was really, really embarrassed by the fact that my own bias about how I feel about the police had entered into this. So I won't bore you with the details, but I decided to embed myself in police departments, a few of them, to get a sense of what the police might actually be maximizing. The first police department was Camden, New Jersey. I highly recommend people, if you really want to know about the police, you got to get inside there and go respond to some 911 calls with police and see what they see. I would not recommend Camden. It was a shit show. But it was probably the best education I'd gotten since my grandmother taught me how to read. It was phenomenal. I was a really bad police officer, and I'm embarrassed to say that after a few hours in a police car, everyone seemed like a criminal to me. I mean, it was clear I should stay a professor and not be a police officer. But over the next few years, I wrote 3 papers. I'm finishing up the last one now, which try to get to the sense of what's actually going on with policing in America. So I'm going to summarize those. Maybe one of you is one of the 7 who actually read one of them. The first was to try to understand what's going on with police use of force, and in fact, what's going on with police shootings. We collected two types of data on police use of force. The first was we had millions of observations of police stops of civilians. And in those stops, they recorded whether or not they'd actually used force. The reason that's important is because in most police departments at that time, regular old everyday uses of force were not actually recorded, okay? Particularly because often uses of force happen in the process of an arrest. So if I'm going to arrest Harvey and I throw him up against the car, slap him around a little bit, put some cuffs on him, and throw him in the back of the car, that data is never recorded. That is not abnormal. That's just Tuesday. So this data set was phenomenal in that I had literally millions of stops. And for each one of those stops, the police reported, that's important, we'll come back to that. The police reported whether or not they had used verbal, raised their voice at someone, whether they put their hands on them, whether they had thrown them up against a car, whether they pulled a weapon, whether they actually put handcuffs on them, and then the outcomes of it. Were they arrested? Did they find contraband? Was the person compliant, et cetera? It wasn't, no data set is perfect, but this was pretty good. And in that data, what we found was that on everyday uses of force, black civilians are 50% more likely in any interaction to have force used on them relative to whites. So 54%. That's with no controls. That's just, black civilians also live in more dangerous neighborhoods. They, maybe their behavior with the police is different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So once we controlled for everything you can imagine, I'm just going to put it that way, and we can get to the details in a second. Literally, because we have millions of observations, we can say, okay, did the police officer stop them in a high crime neighborhood, low crime neighborhood? Or we could even control for, was it on this corner? Like we could geocode it, like where exactly was this interaction? And was the person perfectly compliant, et cetera, okay? My favorite, whatever that means, coefficient is even in stops where the police report that the civilian is perfectly compliant, there's no outcome from the stop, meaning there's no contraband, there's no arrest, person just goes on about their way, and again, they're perfectly compliant. Even in those interactions, the probability of force being used on a black civilian is 25% higher than a white civilian. Okay. Nothing we could do could get rid of that. And that was from the, and so, I took a lot of criticism for this. People said, oh, how dumb is he? He's using data that the police report. Right. But take a deep breath and think for a second. If you find bias, even though the police are reporting these people are compliant, then that probably is a lower bound to what's actually out there, not the. And in fact, we found other data from the civilian perspective, and they report way more bias than the police do. But even if you believe the police reports, there's still something policy relevant here to combat. Okay, so that was the first part of that paper, which was there are large racial differences in use of force. We not only did the simple regressions and things like that where we control for a bunch of things, we also did formal discrimination tests, and indeed, we concluded that this was discrimination by the police. The second part of the paper was about the next level use of force, which was police shootings. Here, we collected two types of data. From about 15 or 16 cities across the country, we had a data set of all the shootings that took place and all the characteristics of those shootings. Every shooting has 300-page report that comes with it. We took those reports and gleaned roughly 200 variables from those reports and created a data set out of those reports. Okay. But in statistical parlance, we only had the ones, not the zeros. Meaning we had the shootings, but we did not have the shootings that could have happened but didn't. So in one city, we had the ones and the zeros. Now, let me back up just one step. The media, I mean, this was a crazy time of life. I mean, the Washington Post was acting like social scientists, right? They were putting out their reports on police shootings. When the hell have they ever done that? I don't remember the Washington Post report on education. Right? I mean, it's just silly, right? Lucky for you, they're not creeping into political science. Well, actually, they are. Never mind. Not the quantitative part. No one has that data, right? Like it was their data are things like, what is the fraction of black people unarmed who were shot relative to the fraction of white people who were unarmed that were shot? I don't know about you. I've never heard of that as a sufficient statistic for anything. Why is that even interesting? Right? That's like a regression with one control. What does it even mean? But that's the kind of thing that was out there. So those 15 or 16 cities where we just had the ones, it's not perfect, but it's way better than what the other media outlets had. But then we went to Houston, and Houston allowed us in to collect the zeros. I don't know why. I think we were the luckiest people on the planet. I have a sense of it now. There was actually a black police chief there who was, literally just called me up and says, "Here you're doing this research, really want Houston to be involved, but probably should start soon." So we got down there. They wouldn't send us any data. We had to send a group of research assistants every Monday, like consultants, and we went down to the Houston Police Department. We sat there. We had to pay a sergeant $50 an hour to watch us type in the data. They would not allow our computers on their network. They wouldn't allow thumb drives. They wouldn't allow anything because they were worried about us putting spyware or whatever on their computers. I was like, dude, we're economists. Like, it's not going to happen. In any event, so we did that for roughly 6 months. We got the data, and it allowed us to go through and look through all their arrest codes and say, here is a situation where the police could have lawfully used force and didn't. So then the counterfactual became much more clear, like we'd want, which is 80% of the data looked like this. There is a call for service, meaning a 911 call. A person is wielding a weapon in a bodega. The police arrive on the scene, and there's a shooting takes place. The question we were asking was, does the race of the suspect predict whether or not the officer discharges their weapon? Okay? And the answer, emphatically, is no. The Houston data was so good that we could even, officers in Houston have a Glock 9 on their strong hip and they have a taser on their weak hip. So we could even look, did they shoot with the gun versus the taser? That was another 1-0 we could do. The answer to that, again, was nothing. So we didn't find any racial bias in the police shootings. Okay. And now some have said, well, that's not how it happens. You don't account for the fact that police are more likely to interact with black suspects. You're right, we did not. But just because you've seen 10 videos where it's a police stop and they escalate and that's how a shooting happens, that is not what the data tell you, right? The data is a call for service, a 911 call of something, of a robbery or some sort of crime in progress. The police go there and a shooting happens. That is where the mass of the data are. In the Q&A, maybe we can talk about social science's response to this work, because that was more troubling than the work itself. In any event, that's what we found in that paper, in the first paper. We found that on lower level uses of force, there are huge racial differences, in fact, racial discrimination. In police shootings, however, we don't find it. Our explanation, now this is speculative, is that the cost of lower level uses of force is just a lot lower than the cost of shootings. And that's why you see the difference. In other words, and this is a very economic way of thinking about it, officers can afford to pleasure in their bias for things when it's cheap. But when it's expensive, meaning there's going to be a long investigation, et cetera, you could lose your pension, you might even be put in jail, even though that didn't happen very often back then, they would not do it. So the price was just too high. Okay. Second paper we wrote was, okay, well, we have all this, so there is some unconstitutional policing. What do we do with it? Because it's a very interesting contracting problem. And so the first kind of thing to think about was, well, what are they doing already? So the government has these things called pattern or practice investigations. And what they do is when a police department or civilians have complained enough to the government, they will initiate an investigation, right? So chief of police, assistant chief of police from a city that is being investigated right now was in my office last week telling me about the investigation, what they found, and the methods they used. It was a fascinating discussion. Well, from her perspective, I thought she was phenomenal. And so we looked at that. Do these actually help or do they not help? And what we found was that before Michael Brown and before this kind of environment of hyper-attention to police behavior, these pattern of practice investigations didn't amount to much. Crime didn't change that much after them. So we did an event study for all of the pattern of practice investigations that have ever happened. And it didn't do much at all. After Michael Brown, however, they have had huge impacts on both total crime and homicides. I'm going to show you this in just a second. I'll flip to that slide. It's really phenomenal because we can even look at, so you might say, hey, we're Roland, the world really changed in terms of policing after Michael Brown. And so what you're doing is you're confusing the moment with the investigation. It's a valid point. It's just wrong. Because we can look at viral shootings, meaning they've got millions of YouTube of views on the internet, where there wasn't an investigation versus viral shootings where there was an investigation. And I can show you that crime only goes up in places where there's an investigation. Okay, so by our estimates, the investigations into Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and Freddie Gray in Baltimore led to roughly 800 excess murders in those cities over the next 24 months. Okay?
Altogether?
Altogether. Let me just show you that. Close your eyes because it's going to get dizzy. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about. Couldn't commit. All right, here we go. That's not it. This is, you have a commitment problem. You come in, Harvey says, you can talk for 30 minutes, and I brought 138 slides. Okay. This is the OLS stuff I didn't show you. All right. I have to say this. I'm going to back way up. This is kind of cool. Okay. Forgot about this. So what I did, because I have this obsession with journalists deciding they're economist, and I also have the opposite obsession with my colleagues deciding they're journalists, is that people were worried about my data set. They were like, oh, he only found data that was good and the data that's bad or whatever. And so what I did was I looked at all the statistics that they carried. So because my data was a lot more detailed than the data that the Guardian has or the Washington Post. So I decided to replicate their statistics in my own data. Okay, I put this out in the AEA conference volume, which means really no one read it. But I thought it was pretty cool. So what it shows here is that so the Guardian put out their statistic was the likelihood of black men between the ages of 15 to 34 to be killed by police compared to others, right? And so they were like, the Guardian put out was 9.67. This is a big deal. Nearly 10 times more likely, right? And okay, I'm going to go a little bit over my 30 minutes. Sorry. 10 times more likely. And well-meaning, well-trained social scientists lost their minds. They were like 10 times, well, there must be discrimination in there because 10 is too big. What does that even mean? I don't remember the too big test. Is that an F test? I don't know what that is, right? And so if I use that exact statistic in my data, I get 13.8. Got even more discrimination in my data according to that. If I use the Washington Post, which is the percent of black civilians among the unarmed men killed by police, and that is the Washington Post, what did they find? 34, right? Huge. Nope, I win 43. Right? On the discrimination Olympics, I got 2 gold medals. When it comes to Vice, had another one, the percent unarmed in sample versus the percent black civilians in the sample. You can see the ratios here. What is that? Vice is here. Okay, they kind of win that one. They got a silver medal. You get the idea. And Ross, this was the paper that everyone thought was really great, was the probability of being black and unarmed and shot by the police relative to the probability of being white, unarmed, and shot by the police. And for Ross, that was 3.49. Again, I can calculate that same statistic in my data. I get 5.43. And so I produced this table because then President Obama, when I talked to him, he says, I just think you have data from enlightened police departments. And I said, I have data. Most of my data comes from Florida and Texas. Would you have said ex ante? Those were the most enlightened places around? And he just laughed. And so I produced this to show them it wasn't enlightened. It was actually that there's this thing called statistics. Okay. All right. Where was I? Sorry. Got off. Oh, here we are. This is good. Okay. We don't want to do that. Okay. Here's just Baltimore. I'm going to show you the city by city. These are synthetic controls to the left. This is the event study. And so you can see the black line is Baltimore. The gray line are the synthetic cities. And so you can see that there's a jump up in homicides in Baltimore post the investigation. And so this gives you the cumulative effect of the kind of homicides per 100,000 in the months following the investigation. So it's the area under here. Yeah. And so you can see these are standard error bars. This is statistically quite significant that using this event study that there's a causal effect on homicide rates in Baltimore. This is total crime. That also went up. This is Chicago after Laquan McDonald. That went up. And this is total crime. This is Cincinnati, Ohio, et cetera, et cetera. So I go through each one of these things. St. Louis, we couldn't get Ferguson because it's not a principal city. I won't go into the details, but you get the idea. All right. So I went through a bunch of other explanations. Now, for time purposes, I'll skip to the thing that we think happened. Our data basically showed us that the big difference that happened in the cities where there was a viral video and an investigation relative to just a viral video was that the police stopped policing. Okay? They, for whatever reason, decided, hey, I'm not going to stop people who look suspicious to me anymore. Cost is too high. All right? Let me prove that to you. Oh boy. Okay. Sorry. This is what happens when you too many. Okay. This is the best graph. I have one more graph. I'm going to show you that this is the best I've ever created in my career. I mean, this is almost Rod Chetty level right here. So these are all police civilian contacts for Chicago. Okay. The 0 is the month the investigation happened. The reason Chicago is so amazing is because the shooting happened a year before we ever knew it, before it was released as a video. Mm-hmm. Right? And they investigated pretty immediately. And so this is kind of those are monthly contacts. These are 3x5 cards that any like when they police pull over someone or pat them down, they fill out a 3x5 card, let them go. Okay? And the card is the data that we have. Rahm Emanuel was mayor at the time, and he gave us this data. It was incredible. So our estimates here is this is an 89% drop in the amount of police-civilian interactions from month to month. Okay? I can do better than that. This is daily. This is as good as it's going to get. If you don't believe this, I got nothing else for you. So this is, the black line is the day that the video was released, Laquan McDonald. This is the day the investigation was announced. So you see it's kind of middling here. It drops but then it rebounds. And then the investigation is announced, and it never recovers. Okay? St. Louis the same. One more. Let me show you. This is crazy. Baltimore. Okay. Whoa. All right. I just want to point out, these are the shaded areas when the riots were in Baltimore. Make sure you understand that this is zero. There were 0 traffic stops in Baltimore during this time. Have you ever been to Baltimore? 0. Right? Okay. That's the basic idea, is that what happens, what I'm trying to get at is the economics of this. We started earlier about police maximizing something. Third thing I'm going to, okay. You can't, during this time, as a social scientist, whether it's political science or economics, doesn't matter. It was really frustrating to be an academic because you saw people, well, I guess what they call now virtue signaling. I don't know what they were doing, but they were beating their chest going, we don't, police, defund the police. I never met anybody in the inner cities who were saying that. It was like, And so you had this situation where people just thought it would be cool to pile on without thinking about what the police were maximizing. In other words, their response helps determine the equilibrium, right? And when we start giving this paper, my colleague's first reaction was, whoa, policing matters? Like, of course, like, yes. And so that leads to the third point. How do we regulate police departments with unknown bias? It's a hard problem, right? Because imagine you have 2 types of police officers, good and bad, and you've got 2 types of states of the world, good or bad. For any bad video or tough to watch video, that could be a good cop in a bad situation or a bad cop in a perfectly fine situation. And you don't know the difference. And how do we actually design policy that's going to differentiate between those 2? It's a regulation problem unlike we've ever seen in economics because it's got 2 dimensions of uncertainty. It's got adverse selection and it has moral hazard, right? If you take economics, I don't know, pick a number, you will deal with regulation problems that have 1 part of that, 1 dimension of that, but never 2. And so it becomes really, really difficult to think about. In other words, how do you change the behavior of bad officers without influencing the behavior of the good ones? And that's what we're working on, trying to design, just mathematically at this point, optimal mechanisms of how do you regulate a police department with unknown types of bias. And, this is it's such an interesting academic problem because, we often think, well, why do the good cops defend the bad cops? Part of the reason is because they sometimes will be in states of the world where you think they're a bad cop. And so if they don't know if they're in that state of the world, they're going to defend that person too. So they have the same protections later, right? And now, one of the things I'm most excited about is with the advent of, with the spread of body cameras, with the advent of AI, there might be ways of collecting enough information in everyday interactions to figure out, to have more of a time series on behavior instead of looking at one instance in isolation. And there actually may be statistical ways to try to identify the good cops from the bad cops when an incident happens. But that is a hard regulation problem and not something that either the federal government or either of our departments have thought a lot about. But I think it is the key problem. And I'll close with this. There was a meeting in Washington during the height of the riots and things like that were going on in 2018. Maybe it was 2017. And I went to this meeting and it had, the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it had civil rights leaders and government officials, and stuff like that, and then a few nerds like me. And I think it's the only thing that Al Sharpton and I have ever agreed on, is that part of the distrust in Black communities of what the motivations were around shootings when they're kind of controversial and we don't really understand what happened is because of the everyday discrimination that goes on. And so the whole effort that day was about what can we do to eliminate the bias in the lower level uses of force so that we can build trust in communities so that we can partner together on the higher level uses of force, right? And in fact, if you think about it from a community member standpoint, it's almost irrational not to think that shootings are biased. Because if the lower level stuff is biased, I mean, if you're a Bayesian, you think, well, there was a shooting over there, we don't know what happened. Well, they beat me up yesterday, I didn't do anything. I'm pretty sure it was biased, right? And so even Al Sharpton said, and I will take this to my grave because, again, I don't think we could agree on much, is he said, yeah, what that guy said, if you weren't harassing us every day, then we would be willing to talk to you about the shootings, right? And so I think part of the regulation problem has to start on things that are lower level, right? Because police officers really aren't willing to negotiate on the shooting stuff. Their view is they're trying to get home too. That's what they're trying to maximize. And if they think they're in danger, they're going to react. But they do know that like beating up a Black kid in an alley is like, probably not necessary. It's just enjoyable for some of them. And so if we can figure out how to stop that and disincentivize that, then I think we can work our way up to thinking about what optimal police reform should look like. Okay, I'll stop there.
We're spellbound. Oh, no, here's a question up here.
Can you speak to any effect that the widespread adoption of body cameras has had on these problems? If it's been beneficial, no effects otherwise?
There have been a few early studies. I am not up to date on the most current causal effect of body cameras. There was early stuff in like Riverside, California, and a couple of other places, another place I'm forgetting, where, the effect was kind of very small, if not zero. But I think that was mainly a technology question and not like what you can, I think of body cams as being able to enable other things because you have large data sets now, not because the body cameras themselves are the treatment. Does that make sense?
Yep.
There was some hope that just putting body cameras on people would police would fundamentally change their behavior. I just don't think that's true at all. But I do believe that body cameras will be data sets that will enable technology to make real change. And there are companies out there like Trulio that are, I just met with the CTO yesterday. What they're trying to do is really phenomenal because they are analyzing all the audio, because video is too expensive, that comes out of body cams and using it for professional development for police officers. And I think that is a very promising technology. And they've started to run some studies to show that is actually very effective on police. So I'm hopeful that in the next 5 to 10 years, some combination of social science and AI will be really interesting. I'm slightly worried. One caveat would be AI alone not scares me, but I think it's probably not the right thing because it doesn't include context. It's just, And so, but I think it's a very exciting area. And my guess is yes, that there's some good stuff out there. Sure.
No.
Early on, in situations, police reported in situations where the suspect or the person stopped was cooperative, there was still force used. So was that just explain a little bit. They reported that, and it seems unjustified. They just hauled off and hit somebody and didn't mind putting in a report, or what?
Yeah, I think if it's not penalized, then the incentives to tell the truth are there, right? Like there's no disincentive to tell the truth. So that's exactly what we see in the data. Now, did someone behave in a way that the police officer didn't like, but that was still compliant? I don't know, right? Police officers tell me that the worst crime you can do is contempt of cop, right? So if they didn't feel respected in the right way, something like that, or maybe they were fearful themselves, you know? For example, maybe they were outnumbered and so they threw everybody up against the car and told them to sit there, even though the people were completely compliant. I don't know, I'm just guessing, but I could imagine situations where that would actually be the case, where you'd be, compliance would be perfect, but you'd still have some force used. Anyone, go ahead.
In your work, was it possible for you to control for racial differences in police departments? Was the outcome different for cops who were white or cops who were Latino or cops who were African American? Is that possible? Or do police departments see themselves, you know, in certain cities and certain precincts as a unit and they all move as one force? So what's your read on the culture in the police departments?
Yeah, we were able to do that. If anything, black police officers in our data had a little bit more bias towards white civilians. But other than that, nothing else. They weren't less biased against black civilians or anything like that. We definitely looked for that. And what's interesting about police departments is, which at least I didn't understand, because my view of police was like two people in a car riding around fighting crime. That's how it is in the movies. It's one person riding around like an Uber driver looking for stuff. And that's a very different object, right? Some cities are different. Camden actually did have community policing where they actually walked a beat. Really hard to get by the union, but that I saw be really interestingly effective, precisely because they had more information on people, right? So I was walking around with a police officer in Camden, and we were walking his beat. Some person comes up and just starts yelling at the police officer and acting crazy, and I'm like nudging him, aren't you going to do something about this, right? Like, and he says, that's Johnny. He does this every day afternoon. Right? But if you're not there every day, you wouldn't know that this was a normal pattern. Versus in Houston, they literally are Uber drivers. They ride around the city and they look out their windows for problems. And so when you see someone looking like that, the first thing you're going to do is stop them and throw them up against a car and be like, what the hell's wrong with you? Right? And so I think this idea I'm trying to get at, not very elegantly, is this is really an information problem. And so anything, technology or structure or culture that you can do to add information here so that police officers can differentiate the good people from the bad people is very effective at helping solve this problem. Yes, sir.
My name is Harvey Silverlid. I'm the other Harvey. I'm a criminal defense and civil liberties lawyer, and during the Vietnam War, I represented dozens of young men who refused induction on they were opposed to the war. And I never had a client go to prison because the federal judges always took my recommendation as follows. The clients would agree to 2 years of community service. Most of the community service, they served to help the police departments in their towns. The idea was that a young refusenik would accompany an officer on his or her street or patrols daily. There wasn't a single incident of abuse of a citizen in any of those situations. And the reason is there was a court-appointed witness in every one of those situations. And the police would not beat up, whether it was a black person or a white person or an Oriental person, the police would not beat somebody up in front of a court-appointed witness. And that gave me an idea that I had recommended on several occasions to, for example, the city council here in Cambridge. No one's ever adopted it, but the idea is this. It would be a terrific expenditure of public funds to have young men and women paid for a year or two to accompany police officers on their rounds as assistants, right? Not as witnesses, as assistants, but effectively they would serve as witnesses. And I've never heard of a case where in front of, especially a court-appointed witness, this would be a municipally appointed witness. So the problem are credible civilian witnesses, and I think that would be a very important reform if we could ever get it passed.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, do you think that body cams serve to do a little bit of that now?
I think it partly, yes.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with body cams is the batteries and the angles and stuff like that, right?
That's one problem, and also they don't always capture everything.
They normally don't.
Who has status. It's not just an ordinary street passerby, but a human being whose job is to, quote, help the police officer, when in fact he or she is monitoring as well. Yeah. Turned out to be extraordinarily effective. I was very impressed by it.
It's a fascinating idea. I'd love to think about it a little bit more. I think it's the upsides you mentioned, and I think I agree with a lot of that. I think that's really interesting. I think the potential downsides are the incentives for these people to tell the truth over time, right? Because, how do you protect them when they say the police officer did really, really badly? So do they start to come under this, what do they call it, the blue curtain or whatever? Do they start to come under that too over time if they do this enough?
They would have 1 or 2 year terms.
I see. I like this. Police for America. We'd do it. We'd get some of the graduates instead of Teach for America. We'll do Police for America. I'm all for that. I think it's a really interesting idea. It's right on this dimension of more information, right? So
a lot of Harvard students would sign up for that.
100%. Yeah.
Aside from your academic colleagues, how much influence do you find you're having with people who actually make decisions? How much effect are your studies having on, decisions about these pattern of practice studies? How much do people want to come talk to you and get your input?
Nearly zero. Arlington Police Department's changed their policies. I'm not arrogant enough to think it had anything to do with my work. This is part of the reason that I got really frustrated during this time of my career, because this will sound more arrogant than I want it to, but I'm sorry. When I wrote this first paper on police use of force, from my metrics, it's all I ever asked for in terms of academics, right? Before all the hullabaloo about whether or not, okay? But at that time, the paper was published in our top journal in economics. It broke the NBER downloads record. I was at the White House for 5 hours meeting with President Obama about changing things, and we were going to link police funding to the collection of lower level uses of force. I mean, it was everything I thought that we came here to do. And then we all know what happened, right? Trump goes to office. And when it looked like Trump was going to be there, Obama and Valerie Jarrett introduced me to Comey, who's the FBI director, because they said, hey, he'll be here for 10 years or 8 years at that point. Like, go tie this to him, and so that way it will survive the political upheaval that's about to happen. Great. Well, we all know the end of this story, right? Trump, forget politics. Trump comes in, fires Comey. We get none of this stuff done. And it was very, very, very frustrating. And in fact, what you saw was people going in the opposite direction of this, right? I mean, my own department put out a statement on its website about police use of force. It says, what we know is that it's so biased on police shoot. And I'm like, do you? And so, I mean, I couldn't even have influence on my own department's website. I mean, much less a police department. And so I think...
But Obama was persuaded.
I don't know if he was... I don't know. He was certainly willing to listen, put it that way. Loretta Lynch was willing to listen. The current administration is not. The current administration is tripling down on pattern of practice investigations that, the latest results, which I haven't even put in table form, are that there are, nearly 2,000 murders in black communities. I mean, do you know how frustrating this is? It's like people are sitting there in press conferences with Black Lives Matter patches telling me they're going to do pattern of practice investigations with a published paper that says, if you do that, we're going to lose you know. It's so crazy.
How do you explain that?
I guess it's politics, I guess. I mean, I can't explain it.
I have a related question.
Yeah.
I've been looking at your charts and seeing how something going viral, a body camera or whatever, recording going viral, you didn't mean to present it this way, I don't think, but you sort of said that didn't make a big difference. What made the big difference was the investigation. But surely there's some cause and effect between the viral video and the investigation.
But when you have a viral video with no investigation, nothing happens.
Okay.
But you're right, there's an interaction term. When you don't have virality and you have an investigation, nothing happens.
Okay, which brings me to the investigation, which seems to follow from what you've just been saying. And my question is, I'm sure you've tried this, it may be just a left field kind of question, but
Let's do it.
going to the White House is one thing, going to local municipalities, small, mid-sized cities, places where there might be some entree.
Yeah.
Is there some way to, has your work been better received, more closer to the grassroots than, in the White House where
100%. Yes, for sure. Both personally and professionally, by the way. I haven't been pulled over in a while. I did get pulled over and I showed him my paper. I was like, here you go. It's serious, I got pulled over. I was like, dude, have you seen my work? Don't you dare give me a ticket. In the beginning, it's interesting you say that because in the beginning, it evolved over time. But in 2016, we first released this paper. It managed to upset everybody, right? Police officers were saying, how can you possibly call us biased? And my colleagues and others were saying, how can you possibly say there's no shootings, right? It didn't satisfy anyone. As time has gone on, yes, the largest kind of set of people who engage about my research are police administration in exactly those towns you described, right? So I probably should mention the departments by name, but lots of departments across the U.S. have reached out to say, hey, would you help us analyze this or that? Right? I was talking about a particular assistant chief of police last week, because what they're worried about are people using these statistics like unarmed over, what you had for lunch divided by, right, and that kind of stuff. And they're like, can we actually get to a real statistical analysis of our data? Because we think that unless you compare apples with apples, we're going to look bad. And still, right, the assistant chief of police last week said to me, she said, I don't understand. This is actually kind of cool. I mean, so maybe a little bit of impact. She came and says, I've read your 2 published papers on this stuff. And what they're doing is they're saying African Americans in our city are this % of the population and they're this % of the stops. And so therefore it must be discrimination. But she said, literally, you say in your paper, that's not what to do. And so we want them to do a better analysis as part of the pattern of practice investigation. She was very earnest. She said, we do have problems. I do want to fix them. But don't point me towards this if it's not a problem. Like, I want to fix the actual problems, not things that you were just making up with false statistical kind of faux rigor. So that part, yes. I've tried to be helpful when I can, but I'm still looking for something to really scale, right? So until I finish this 3rd paper and try to figure out how do you actually optimally do this, I've been a little skittish against, I'm help on some data stuff, but I haven't been going out saying, here's the thing that they need to adopt and it will solve these problems. I haven't done that yet because I don't know the answer.
I got a question. James Q. Wilson Have you encountered his work?
Who hasn't? Yes.
All right. And he has this book with a wonderful title, Varieties of Police Behavior. Uh-huh. And there are a couple of points in that which might be relevant here, even though they don't have directly to do with race. And one is he made a big distinction between police departments that put the law first. They go by the book, and they therefore think of themselves as enforcing the law. They represent the law. They don't like to be touched by other people. I represent the law, and don't fiddle with me, or come near. And then there's the others that are will look more at the result and are more likely to square off. Take shortcuts. And he found the difference by posting a graduate student to watch them. Where a place where there's a police station and a police parking lot that was across the street, and whether the police parking lot, whether people got off of that parking lot, walked down to the corner, and took the crosswalk to the police station, or they jaywalked straight to the door, and that was open them up to.
I don't know.
Yeah. Now it seems to me that second type would be more open to sort of economic analysis than the first would. And then I'll bring up that word honor again, that they represent the honor of the law, and so don't fool me. And Wilson came up with this nice result that if you're guilty, it's better to be taken by the shortcut police, and if you're not guilty. If you're guilty, it's better to be taken by the book police, because they'll give you your rights. And if you're not guilty, it's better to get someone who will just look at you and let you go.
Okay. I think that you definitely see, at a high level, very different types of police officers in the field. My casual empiricism tells me it varies a lot by age on the force. I would guess if he cross-tabbed the law first versus the results, the younger guys are law first and the results guys are older. But it's an interesting way to think about it. And if we had more data like that, and you could cross that with use of force and other things like that, that would be a really interesting kind of thing to start to think on.
There was a second point too. He looked at the police as a bureaucracy, and a bureaucracy has a central command, and then it has agents who carry out. So there's not much problem if it's the Social Security Administration. They can make rules for each of their agents to follow, and they follow it. Yeah. But with the police, it's always different, because the policeman is coming upon a situation that he doesn't know what he's going to find or what he's going to see, and it's dangerous. And it isn't so much enforcing the law as bringing order to the situation. And so it takes a lot of individual prudence and experience what to do. And what a policeman mainly wants is to be backed up by the guy in the office who's his boss, because it's tough. Yeah, it's a tough job.
I mean, that fits my anecdotal evidence perfectly, which is, police chiefs have told me any solution that requires me to tell the frontline officers what to do is not going to happen, because there's so many different optimal strategies at the end of this game tree when they're interacting with people, that we can't overregulate that. That's number one. And then so this fits completely with what I've seen in the field, and the part about being backed up by the police at Central, I think, by the administration at Central, I think that exactly explains the pullback. Mm-hmm. Is that during this time where there's virality and there's investigation and the federal government is going through our data to see exactly what you do, it doesn't feel like the people back at headquarters have my back. Yeah. And so why engage?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, you had a question earlier, so let me go ahead.
Yes, in terms of your...
I'm listening. I'm going to grab another water so I can keep going. Thanks.
So in terms of your analysis of particularly the low level, in terms that the community sees not much is done with respect to the low level, and I suspect that what happens is when there's something that reaches the viral point, that there's a lot of pent-up frustration that has built up. And it seems to me that part of that reason is that you have, I think, a very difficult time to really punish the people who have offended. You have these police contracts, which make it extremely difficult. And certainly that's in the news all the time. So will you really be able to implement what you would like ideally, which is to deal with the low level as well as the high level, if you've got these existing union contracts in place?
Yeah, I think that's the key. So, one of the organizations have been talking to, as I said before, processes the body cam footage. So, you all probably know this better than I do, but it turns out that Microsoft Azure's largest customer is a company called Axon. Axon is who gives all the body cameras to police. So the main kind of user of OpenAI is actually police departments, which no one would have, I guess, imagined. It is 100 million hours of unwatched footage sitting in the cloud. And what they're trying to do is process that and work with the unions and police officers and city councilmen to use that footage to really bolster police professionalism. So I think if they could be really successful, there's a chance there, right? And so one of the things I hear the most from police officers are that we get no credit for all the times we get it right, right? That, there are tens of thousands of police stops a day. And it's kind of, if you look at it from just a pure hazard rate kind of thing, it's amazing there's not more it's not amazing there's not more stuff that happens in these stops when you consider the behavior of both sides and just the frequency that they happen. And so I think we can use hardware and technology and software to create the right denominator for police officers. Meaning, if we all got punished because we made a mistake in a lecture, misspoke, I guess we kind of do. But, it's helpful in those cases. Some people think it's helpful to actually have context, right? You referred to this group by the wrong politically preferred name. Be helpful to go to video and be like, yeah, but it was just a slip up because the previous 100 times I did it right. Clearly, I didn't mean any offense by it. I'm tired. So that has been resonating with police officers that I talk to. the ability to quantitatively show how often they get it right. When they come to these situations where force had to be used or they made a mistake, they beat up a kid who didn't have anything, that you can look back and say, okay, but in the last 2 years, most of the time, those demographics of that kid or whatever, he had something, and it was basically, this was an optimal strategy given all the data that we've seen. That is making them feel more comfortable. So I think the next step in that is, yes, I do believe, perhaps naively, that if police departments view this as their insurance, that you can build trust with them. And that kind of data will be, then you really will be capturing data on these everyday uses of force. Some will be part of duty, and part of it will be excessive. And I think technology will allow us to design incentive schemes to get rid of the excess.
Which news media were open to your findings and which resisted and didn't think they were fought back with their own biases?
For the first paper on police use of force, the coverage was unlike anything I'd seen. It was pretty wide. So all of them covered the paper. New York Times had a big spread on it. Because at that time, in 2016, it wasn't heresy to say, at least I didn't know it was. People say, Earl, you're brave. No, I was just dumb. I had no idea that this kind of response was going to happen. So I think most of the media, The Guardian didn't cover it. Like, The Guardian, to Washington Post's credit, the people who put out that crazy statistic when they interviewed me after our paper came out, they're like, wow, this is better than what we did. The Guardian was not with it, and some of the other extreme political leaning people were not. Most of the mainstream media was okay with it. What was interesting is when the second paper came around on pattern and practice, I don't think I've ever gotten into a fiercer argument than with the New York Times criminal justice reporter. And he just refused to cover it. He says, I'm just not telling you these investigations are good. And I said, how do you know? And he said, well, I've been right there when they happened. And I go, so you can do event studies in your head. You're a genius. Right? And so we went at it for an hour or so. And he just said, I think it would be irresponsible for me to cover this. And he refused. Wall Street Journal did cover that later. But the political attitude of this work has changed a lot over time. In 2016, it was way less explosive to talk about these things than they would be now. I think that the thing we haven't talked about, which is the most insidious problem, frankly, is that a bunch of our own academics have found similar results but decided to hide them in appendices. That's the real crime.
Yeah.
Sorry, there was a question. You've had your head
Sorry.
full.
Yeah.
This is from an anecdote from the mid-1980s, before cell phone videos. And this was on Comm Ave. Two guys started out in a brawl, and one pulled a knife. Police were called. One officer shows up. The guy is standing there with a knife. The officer 3 times says, drop the knife. The guy doesn't. The policeman pulls his baton and smashes the guy's arm, and the knife falls away. He didn't pull a gun. At worst, the man's arm was bruised or broken. And do police have batons now, or?
Yeah, they do.
I saw this police officer he came up within 2 feet of the guy, never pulled his gun, and I thought he really assessed the situation. Are things different now?
I'm really, really glad you put that anecdote in, because
So yes, things are different now. And your intuition, if I can call it that, and experiences are, I didn't have the experience, but I had the same intuition. So when I embedded myself in the police departments, one of the things we talked about as we rode around was, why don't you guys do something different besides pull a gun? Well, I had other ideas because I like James Bond movies. So I was like, why don't you shoot him in the leg? And one of the guys took me to a shooting range, and they moved the thing really fast. They said, you shoot him in the leg. It turns out it's really hard to shoot him in the leg. Underlying your point is something super important, which is like, what's the optimal use of force? Forget race for a second. What should the police officers actually be doing? The fraction of shootings in our data that are a person's wielding a knife or a crowbar is really, for my taste, what do I care? But what do people care about me? But like, is relatively high. And so in that situation, they will be perfectly justified shooting them now. And they would be scared to get that close where you could use a baton. And so probably in most cities I've seen, that would result in a police shooting. I think part of it is, this is purely guessing, but my guess is it has something to do with the skill of the officer. And I think highly skilled officers can do what you just described. I think less skilled officers who frankly might be scared. I've had officers tell me that bullets are actually less bad than a knife in terms of what they're worried about. And so, yeah, I don't know what the optimal use of optimal force is. I really don't. I've even thought to myself, because I'm an economist, like, what's the right ratio of police to civilians being injured in these interactions? Police say they should be all, they should never be police, but I mean, clearly from a social welfare function, that can't be exactly right. So I think this is a really, really great question. I think that most police officers I've talked to off the record would have used lethal force in that regard.
The other part of it too is the officer was white and the man with the knife was white.
Yeah.
And I often wonder what it would have been if that man was black.
Yeah, well, if you believe my Houston stuff, the answer would be no different, because we did exactly that. We controlled for those. We were in those situations where deadly force should have been used, or could have been used, not should have been, could have been used, and there was no racial difference in whether it was used. I think the question really is like, is that a situation where a taser would be better? Or, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, right? Like, the military has all sorts of interesting toys, right? Like, I mean, I say that in jest, but like they have flashlights that are so bright that they'd be blinding to that guy and they could actually just cuff him, right? That they temporary blindness from light that is really, really bright. There's all sorts of technology. It's kind of amazing that we're still in the 60s where we're pulling revolvers. There's all sorts of ideas that people have about that. I think the one last thing I'd say, because I think it's such a great question, I could go on and on, is like, part of the problem is the police officers are asking themselves, is the knife the only thing he has? And so part of the difference between now and the mid-90s, there's a lot of guns on the street, right? And so when I was in Houston, we'd do traffic stops, and there was 3 or 4 steps before his bulletproof door, which he stood behind in the beginning, and the side of the car where he could stand behind like this. And he was visually scared during those 3 or 4 steps. So when he got back in the car, I said to him, I don't mean this to sound weird or strange or anything like that, but you're a little gingerly boy. It's like there's something a little different about your gait when you leave the protections of this car before you get to where you're shielded by the other car. And he said, dude, this is Houston. Everybody has a gun. I assume everybody I pull over has a gun in the car. My guess is that's not true in 1995 in Boston.
I have a small bundle of questions. So regarding this one, is there data on female police officers versus male police officers today on their use of low-level violence, higher-level violence? Because women might have to, you wouldn't have used the baton even back then, but had to shoot. So that's a separate question. Even low-level violence against female and male civilians would be another interesting thing. And do you have international data? So I'm German. Our latest crime reports are pretty terrifying. Violent crime is going up, if the statistics are to be trusted. The background of people in crime are ever higher. Migrants or these immigrant men that we have been getting. And I don't think that it's a trust issue in European countries because, police don't, I think, tend to rough up people. But it doesn't seem to lower crime at all. It seems to encourage criminals more than it deters them. So you're saying there's a link between low-level violence, trust, poverty, violent crime is your end goal to reduce violent crime, is your end goal to reduce poverty and just, make lives better for these young black men. And is there evidence that would actually happen? Partly from, international comparisons. I don't want to ramble, but I have a lot of questions in this whole area of the effectiveness of all of this.
Okay, let me start with the easier ones because that last one's hard. Maybe I can build up some confidence to roll into it. Use of force on by female versus male officers, I do not remember, but I will go back and look. If you'll shoot me an email, I'll get you that. I don't remember that coefficient. What I do remember, though, is that use of force against females very, very low. But what's interesting is that if you look at racial differences, there is a larger difference in the female group than there is in the male group, in part because white women, the probability they'll have force used on them in an interaction is basically zero. And so it's small for black women, but the ratio is very large relative to males. Internationally, I have tried hard to engage internationally, in part because my wife was born and raised in Vienna, and so I'm always over there with my in-laws, and I need something to do. And so I'd rather hang out with police than my in-laws, and that says something. Please, God, don't let her see this video. I haven't looked into Germany, but I've looked into police departments in Austria, in France, in the UK. And I'd say that one of the big issues I've run into is the actual collection of data. They tell me, I haven't seen, but they tell me is not very good, right? Because I wanted to understand Turkish and Syrian immigrants in Vienna. Because when you go there, I learned German just enough to get her to marry me, and then I stopped.
Just like Harvey, actually.
He's an economist after all. You understand?
Yes, it's optimal.
Exactly. And so I know, when I'm there, there's all these signs in the 10th district and 7th district that are complaining about police use of force, lower level uses of force that are going on. But I have tried multiple times to both get into schools there and into the police departments with no luck. And the French tell me, of course, they don't collect any information on race, but my time in the suburbs around Paris, the actual residents there tell me use of force is one of the biggest problems they have, lower level uses of force.
Have you watched Engrenage, Spiral, that French show?
No.
Okay, that's great. They show violence all the time.
Interesting. I do love a good cop show. So I think there's a lot to be learned internationally. But their willingness to share data has not been the same.
This question over here.
Sure.
Oh yeah, actually, so this is kind of about the community trust problem. And I'm just wondering, is there any data on, the actual differences in the ways that precincts or police departments may be integrated into their communities, and how that might affect these variables, and how do you measure trust between a community and a police department, and where do we see that embodied in like strategies by police departments or community organizations, and you know, like how do we understand that, and what kind of data is at play there?
I don't really know. I mean, I am not aware of any large administrative data sets on trust. That doesn't mean they're not out there. To test a trust hypothesis in my second paper on pattern of practice investigations, we looked at 911 and 311 calls, right? So maybe, the 311 stuff is like, I have a problem at my house, my cat's in a tree. I don't know, that probably doesn't happen, but you get what I'm saying. And if you'd imagine that the community doesn't trust anymore, that might go down for Black people relative to whites. Now that I say that, there is some work in the GSS that shows that Black communities, like the amount of trust in policing pre and post Michael Brown was quite different. So I think there's some survey evidence out there like that. But what you're really asking, I think, is what's the model that actually builds trust in communities, and if we wanted a time series of trust over time, and imagine we wanted to go out and run experiments where trust was the left-hand side variable, I think that's fascinating. No one's doing that kind of stuff that I know about. That's really, really helpful. I have a barrage of theories about that, right? Being here today is making me want to get back in the ring and do some more of this work. But, Jennifer Eberhardt's done this stuff in Stanford looking at language that police use. That probably helps engender trust too. Like, what are the first 5 words out of your mouth? That would be something I might look at, given everyone's been able to distill this body cam stuff down to and process the language. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think it's really, really interesting and important. And I think, my bad first attempt was to look at how much the community wants to actually call the police for help, not in dire straits, but when there's some choice of who you call. That stuff that we showed didn't actually change. Yes.
My question is kind of a little bit broader, but you've mentioned a couple times people leaving things in the appendices, the economics department putting the statement on their website. I'm in the sociology department. I can only imagine what they would have put on the website. So I guess the question is, like, how should we as students, as aspiring academics or academics, kind of try and take back this kind of lean toward presentation bias that's happening, especially because as we present this data, it seems to me like really getting toward the solution is going to have to rely more and more, or at least bridge between economic quantitative data and qualitative data, which requires interpretation and honest interpretation.
Yeah. Oh my God, I don't know. It is. You didn't tell me they're going to be such hard questions. I think that more generally, I get invited often to lunch by graduate students from across the university who ask me what to do with a result that they're scared of. On the one hand, I'm honored that they would reach out to me, although it's clear what they want when they're like, can we have lunch at 3 o'clock? I'm like, I don't want anybody to be in the restaurant. Okay, the reason I'm pausing is because there's a Roland answer and then there's like a rational social scientific answer. And unfortunately, they're not the same. The Roland answer is like, what did you come here for? Right? Like, If you came here to solve problems, then do your best to solve problems, and it doesn't matter what anyone feels or what the ramifications are, right? When I came out of graduate school, my professors literally told me that they didn't think I'd find a job because I was doing racial inequality, and who cared about that? They told me, you sure you don't want to go to India and help them? Because, you know, people like Michael Kremer and others were making a career going to India. And I was like, but Harlem's a lot closer as far as I mean, I wasn't very good in geography, but I think so. And literally, I didn't think I would find a job. Times have changed a lot, right? And so that's great. But my point is I did it anyway, because that's what I wanted to do. And part of what makes being an academic so special is that you got to like, the job is consumption. It's not money, right? They pay us terribly. It is, you have to love it. And so I can't imagine living in a world or being an academic where I was worried that about the result. I mean, this is supposed, like, you're supposed to be slave to your own curiosities. I mean, that's what we do. We used to do. We used to live the life of the mind. That's why I constantly reminisce about the old days where we would sit in a seminar like this, and then it would end at 2, and then we'd go to some local bar, and it would keep going, and it'd get feisty, and it would roll over into someone's house, and like we were there for that. That was consumption. Okay, so that's what, you know, Roland says. What are you here for? Of course you go forward. Of course you do it this way. Of course you take it back. And if enough of you do it, you'll have some power in the profession. I would be remiss if I didn't say that's a risky strategy. The general counsel at a very large, very prestigious public university called me last week and says, how do I take back academic freedom at the university? I said, oh boy. The incentives are not there. You have to change the incentives. People have to believe that if they do the right thing by the data and the data doesn't come out with an answer that people like, that they are going to be not protected, celebrated. And I really do feel like that was true 21 years ago. I don't feel like that's true now. And so I don't know what to do in that regard. I mean, I have the luxury of being old with tenure. And for me, my personality is I'm willing to die on this hill, literally and figuratively. But would I, sorry to lump you in this category, it sounds weird, but would I advise my own daughters to be this way? Probably, but that's because I'm their insurance. Like, I don't, it's a risky strategy, and one should actually think about it. I know that's probably not the, that's the economic way of thinking about it, but it is risky. And I believe institutions like Harvard or others need to find a way to not just protect, but encourage, this type of practice, right? You're not going to get to free inquiry through a task force. You're going to get to it by practicing it, by coming to areas like this and disagreeing and trying to make progress and celebrating the disagreement, right? And so I'm hopeful. Your question even gives me hope that at some point the tides will turn and we will start to say to ourselves, like we did 20 years ago, that the answers to the questions are more important than the short-term personal sacrifice that may happen. Right now, we're not there. And it's not just you. I mean, I teach a large class of undergraduates, and I ask them all the time, where do you all debate? Race, gender, morality, religion. Because when I was in school, that was the best part. It wasn't the classes. And they're like, we don't. And so that's scary. And I'm really worried about, because I've seen really, really smart people who have really, really good ideas about race and gender and the environment, all sorts of things, just decide it's too costly. There was a brilliant economist years ago who came out and wrote a paper on affirmative action. And he just got torn apart. And the next paper he wrote was on the optimal cake eating problem, and people loved that. And I remember talking to him and says, whatever happened to that affirmative action paper? I love that. He was like, no way. Like, never again. So I'm glad to hear you that, there's what really needs to happen is that we need enough people like you, and I'll be arrogant and generous and put myself in your category, and myself and others around the room who care so deeply about the problems that we can't not answer them. And maybe that will get the marginal people in, and we'll keep going.
What, this last question?
No, I have another one too.
Next to last question.
Yeah, we don't have to we don't have to stop.
Not at the bar yet.
Yeah. I don't know.
I want to back up just a little bit, although I appreciate this question this young lady asked, and I appreciate very much your answer. And I tried to read her mind about how she's taking it, but I'm not going to read her notes. Going back to, I'm sort of getting two vibes from you. One is, and it came out of your question, one is the sort of the human dimension of policing and the absolute necessity to understand how that guy feels when he gets out of the car and goes up to the other car. And you have to understand the phenomenological experience of being a cop.
Yes.
And then on the other side, we have all this technology and all this data and all this AI, and somehow that's going to put it all together. So I think you said create the right denominator for guiding police behavior. Now, how's that working out in Western China? I have a little concern about too many rules and too many restrictions and too much thinking done by some combination of human and cyber above you, so that the cop on the beat is so restricted by rules and yeses and nos and do's and don'ts that you may get this dip, some version of the dip that's in your chart. And I was at West Point last fall rather, and I found out a lot from the soldiers and the cadets at West Point, which is that the military used to let junior officers make their own mistakes, and they learn from their mistakes, and all you sort of do is let them go, and then you have to guide them. But now it's all hedged in with rules, and it's all hedged in with do's and don'ts, and they have these thick manuals of how they have to do every single thing except maybe go to the bathroom. And I'm wondering, how do you put those two things together? Because I suspect you thought about it.
Yeah, this is a great question. Although there's misalignment on one point, but the two pieces that you're describing of big data and deep understanding, right? Like little data, right? Big and little data, right? Like that to me is the art of what we all do, right? Forget the labels of political science versus economics. That is the artistry of what we do. I use the little data to inform the hypothesis to test in the big data. Okay. But you never heard me say, let's put a bunch of rules on people. What I'm trying to essentially do is develop a series of bias tests or indicators. So I want them to go do what they're going to do, right? And do I think the technology can be used for professional development to nudge them in a certain way to say, hey, this was alerted to us through our algorithms, and we looked at the video, and, you didn't, let's talk about that interaction. Could we have thought about that differently? I think coaching is fine, maybe. But the whole point of what I want to do is that I want police officers to go be free to be police officers so we don't end up in this, and to realize when they have a bad day, right, where they do something wrong, or they are in a situation where they actually do the right thing and it looks wrong on camera, that we have a wealth of data to then go apply that to. Is this a bad officer? Or is this a good officer in a bad situation? And the only way to know that is to have a lot more data of patterns of behavior to try to understand it instead of over-indexing on this one incident. So that's really but it's not about rules and top down in that way. It's about when there's a troubling event that happens, it's about putting it in context of their other behaviors.
And at what point, what would have to happen in this country for people to actually really be interested in the data and not, as you say, this administration, for instance, is doubling down on the investigations. What would have to happen for people to be willing to have a clear interest in the data? That seems to be a bigger problem, that people just double down because they don't, for some reason, want to hear or see this. It's almost sounds as though sometimes you have the opposite effect of what you want to have because people.
Oh, I specialize in that.
Yeah, and then so yeah.
Expertise is not widely expected.
Call me naive, but I really do believe that the arc of history bends towards truth, and eventually, exactly. I really do believe that, and that I used to believe that all they needed was an awesome table. I don't believe that anymore because I've shown some pretty awesome tables and gotten nowhere. But I do believe the arc of history is long, as Obama said, but it bends towards truth. And I think that's our jobs. And so I think the answer to the question is pretty simple. We have to be able to show a different way. I don't believe the government has much imagination. I think their risk tolerance is really, really high. And so I think we've got to show in 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 cities that this is possible and evaluate the outcomes, right? So this body cam alert system thing I just described is in a small pilot in NYPD right now. If that goes well, NYPD is expected to go wall to wall, every officer to have this and to have that technology on top of that. If we can show that that's actually really effective, I think I'm here. We're all here because we believe at some level that belief has been smushed out of us a little bit in the last decade, but we believe at some level that with enough evidence, rational minds will take over and that we can get policy adoption to work in the right direction. So I think there's two things so I think evidence has got to be the key. I think there are two ways of doing it though, and this is what I've been focused on the last 5 years is there's get the Justice Department to adopt it or provide incentives to do it or what have you. And then, lo and behold, there's this whole thing called a private market where, this company I've described to you is a private startup. They are just out there working with police departments around the world, right? Like they're in Australia, they're in other places around the world where they want to try to make their policing better. And so I think some combination of public and private efforts with the right data will lead to change. So that's what we're trying to do.
What about partisanship? That it isn't just a matter of making people more rational, but
it's poison.
But beating them. That is using crime and the crime as an issue, a partisan issue. Pretty much all the inner cities of America are governed by one party.
Yeah,
what about that?
Well, it's partisanship. It's the whole culture that believes that compromise is weakness. I don't know what to do about that. I'm not enough of a astute observer of political cycles to know if this is a bad stint that will recover and that centricity will come back, or has technology and other differences made us polarized for a very long time. But I think that's part of the problem is the partisanship of it all, which is why I think we need two different types of strategies, right? When I first came to Harvard, I had one strategy: write papers and get the government to adopt them. That was it. And every year I'd fly down to Washington and try to convince somebody that this latest paper was the key to them getting elected or something. And I just don't believe or not-for-profit, of course, you could try that too. I just don't believe that not-for-profits or governments are going to actually get us to where we need to go. Mm-hmm. And so I've been working a lot more with private companies who for whom the result that the social science says is part of their key product, so that all our incentives are aligned. So I think, I think we've got to try different ways, and I think we as academics have under-indexed on the private market as a way to scale our ideas.
Okay. Anyway, this has been great, Roland, and we're impressed. Thanks.